Have you ever had a moment where, in a matter of seconds, the entire world seems to push you out of the place you deserve? On a seemingly ordinary flight, a black lawyer, a successful, calm, and self-respecting man was suddenly asked to give up his seat to a VIP. A gentle request, but with a lot of meaning. A situation that can make anyone feel diminished, judged simply by the color of their skin or appearance. And then, just a few minutes later, that very man was standing between life and death on an entire flight. He had to choose stay silent to avoid trouble, or speak up to protect the truth, to protect himself and the strangers around him. If it were you, how would you react when your dignity was challenged right in front of hundreds of eyes? Would you choose to be patient to be safe? Or would you choose to stand firm in the moment when everything went wrong? There are small moments, but they decide the fate of many people. We invite you to step into this story full of conflict, dignity, and humanity. If this hook touches your emotions, please like, share, and subscribe to join me on this emotional journey ahead. The night Marcus Hale arrived at Newark Liberty Airport, the air had that familiar winter sharpness he'd grown used to during his years living in New Jersey. It cut gently against his cheeks as he stepped out of the black sedan. The kind of cold that didn't bother him anymore, cold that simply reminded him he was alive and still moving forward. He pulled the handle of his carry-on and stood still for a moment, letting the distant hum of aircraft engines settle into his chest. His phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen from his daughter. Liana, a college sophomore in Austin. Dad, text me when you land. Don't forget. Love you. Marcus smiled. A real one. The kind he didn't show often because life rarely paused long enough to let him feel something without needing to hide it. He typed back quickly. I will. Love you too. He slipped the phone into his coat pocket and made his way toward Terminal C. Travelers streamed in around him, parents with sleepy kids, business types walking fast, couples trying to figure out where Gate 134 was. Newark always had that blend of chaos and order, like a big American city condensed into a single building. Marcus had flown through here hundreds of times, usually unnoticed, usually quiet, and always with a purpose. Tonight's purpose was Washington, D.C., where he was scheduled to testify the next morning in a federal hearing on aviation safety modernization. He'd been working on that initiative for nearly 2 years, ever since a mid-air structural failure on a Boeing 737 MAX nearly ended in tragedy. He was one of the few black CEOs in the U.S. with deep expertise in transportation law, and also one of the few who carried the weight of past bias like a scar that never fully faded. But Marcus wasn't headed to D.C. simply as Marcus Hale, CEO of Atlas Legal Tech. He was headed there as a father, too, because the policy he was fighting for would shape a safer world for Liana and every other young person who would eventually sit on the aisle or by the window of a commercial flight. As he walked, he noticed the overhead speaker announcing the final boarding call for a flight to Miami. Somewhere nearby, a kid was crying because they dropped a cup of orange juice. A TSA officer laughed with a coworker. An older couple argued briefly about which way the escalator was. Just ordinary life. The kind of life that made him feel grounded. Marcus always tried to take a moment before every flight to appreciate that life, in its simple form. It reminded him why he took on stress, responsibility, and sometimes battles he didn't ask for. Inside the terminal, the crowd thickened. Bright signs blinked with gate numbers, flight times, and overhead warnings about unattended baggage. People lined up at the coffee shop, even though it was past 9 p.m. A young man brushed past Marcus too quickly, muttering, "Sorry," before disappearing into the crowd. Marcus nodded, though the stranger was already gone. He checked the display board for his flight. Global Atlantic Flight 227, Gate C108. On time. Good. He hated rushing. He moved toward the security line, weaving between travelers until he found a rhythm stride steady, shoulders relaxed, breath even. But something tugged gently inside him, like a tight thread being pulled from a sweater, a small uneasiness he couldn't name. Not quite fear, not even concern, just a whisper in instinct. He brushed it aside. He'd learned long ago not to let every flicker of intuition turn into a storm. Life had noise. His job was to know which noises mattered. A TSA officer waved him forward. Marcus offered a polite nod and handed over his passport and boarding pass. The officer glanced between the ID and his face, then gave a small, approving gesture. "You're all set. Safe travels," the officer said. "Thank you," Marcus replied. He gathered his things and slipped his shoes back on. As he stood, he noticed the reflection of an airplane through the glass wall behind security. The taillights blinked in a steady rhythm. For some reason, it held his attention longer than it should have. Maybe because he'd spent half his life studying these machines, how they flew, how they failed, and how many lives depended on every bolt being in the right place, tightened by the right hands. He walked through the terminal toward gate C108. The closer he got, the more he sensed a distinct energy around the waiting area. It wasn't anything alarming, more like a subtle tension in the air, stiff postures, forced smiles, people glancing around a bit too often, as if something or someone had arrived before him. Marcus wasn't wrong. Just ahead, a group of Global Atlantic staff stood in a half-circle formation. They weren't talking. They were arranging themselves, polishing their uniforms, adjusting their posture, preparing. For what? That wasn't clear yet. Near them stood a tall man in a charcoal coat, flanked by two assistants holding tablets. Another man in a blue suit, possibly PR, was speaking quietly with the gate agent. Marcus didn't recognize him, but the man carried an air of entitlement so intense it nearly fogged the windows. A VIP, the kind that made people act different. Marcus sighed inwardly. He'd dealt with enough VIPs to know what came next: exceptions, inconveniences, special rules suddenly appearing out of nowhere. He didn't mind VIPs existing. What he minded was when the world bent for them while ignoring everyone else standing in line. He shook off the thought and approached the gate agent. She scanned his ticket, offered a smile, and invited him to board early. Marcus thanked her and stepped through the jet bridge tunnel. Inside, the air grew cooler, that familiar faint scent of cabin fabric and recycled ventilation wrapped around him, the kind of smell that told him he'd be airborne soon. He stepped into the business cabin, calm and quiet. Soft, golden lights cast a warm glow along the curved overhead bins. A few passengers were already seated, tapping on laptops or adjusting blankets. Flight attendants moved with practiced grace. Marcus spotted seat 3A, his preferred seat, by the window, close to the wing, safe, predictable. A place where he could work, breathe, and think. For now, everything was peaceful, but in less than 20 minutes, this quiet would break, and this man, this calm, soft-spoken black CEO would be at the center of a storm neither the airline nor the VIP expected, a storm that would end with a grounded flight, a federal investigation, and a truth that refused to stay hidden. Tonight, Marcus Hale wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble was already walking toward him. The cabin lights glowed a soft gold as Marcus settled into seat 3A. He placed his leather briefcase under the seat in front of him, then rested his palm briefly on the armrest, grounding himself. He'd always preferred the left window seats. From there, he could see the wing, the engine, and, if the angle was right, the mechanics working before pushback. It gave him comfort, though he rarely told anyone that. A flight is a strange thing, he often thought, hundreds of lives suspended in the sky, trusting metal, hands, and judgment. Some people found that frightening. Marcus found it humbling. He leaned back and released a slow breath. His shoulders softened for the first time that day. Moments later, a flight attendant approached with a warm smile. Not Lydia Crane, someone younger, softer around the eyes. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you something to drink? Water sparkling, maybe a ginger ale." Her kindness wasn't exaggerated, just natural. It steadied him. "Water's fine," Marcus said. As she walked away, he watched her move light steps, practiced but genuine. Small human kindness had a way of quieting the louder harms he'd seen in life. He pulled out his phone again. A photo of Liana filled the screen her at the university library, holding up a textbook like it weighed more than she did. He chuckled. She would never know how much light she carried in one smile. He started typing a message, boarded. "Might sleep early tonight. We'll call you in the morning." But he didn't send it. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. A part of him wished he could say more, wish he could tell her about his own fears, the pressure he often hid under layers of composure, the moments he doubted whether the world truly changed enough for men like him, men who had earned everything but still felt as if someone could take it away with one careless assumption. But fathers didn't burden their daughters with truth that heavy. He closed the message and slipped the phone away. When the young attendant returned with his water, Marcus thanked her, then turned his gaze out the window. The tarmac stretched wide under bright floodlights. Ground crew in reflective vests moved around, purposefully loading bags, checking doors, inspecting equipment. He watched a luggage cart pass beneath the wing, then disappear behind the engine. A memory shadowed the moment. He was 22, still in law school, flying home to Louisiana after a grueling semester. He'd booked his ticket months in advance, saved every dollar, and chosen a front-row seat in economy, just enough legroom so he wouldn't cramp up. He remembered the way the flight attendant had looked at him. The pause. The raised eyebrow. The silent assumption that the seat he was in couldn't possibly be his. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" she had asked. There was no malice, just the soft cruelty of bias that didn't even know it was bias. He'd been too young to answer with confidence, too tired to fight. He had moved to a middle seat in the back row between a crying toddler and a man whose elbow took more space than it should. Marcus had promised himself it would be the last time he let anyone make him small. Yet here he was, 20 years later, still bracing for the possibility that someone might look at him the same way, that beneath the layers of success, education, and achievement, he might still be seen first as someone out of place. He sipped his water and felt the old ache settle in. A boarding announcement echoed softly through the cabin. More passengers entered, talking, laughing, negotiating space for their bags. The energy shifted as the aircraft filled. The quiet, empty cabin had turned into a small, moving world with its own rules and unspoken tensions. Row 2 filled with a pair of executives trading casual chatter about quarterly projections. Across the aisle, a retired couple discussed vacation plans. Behind him, someone was already asking for a blanket. Normal. That was the word for this moment. Then the atmosphere changed. It happened subtly at first, just a stir near the front, a hush rolling backward like a wave. The footsteps changed too, somehow slower, more deliberate. The kind of silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was expectant. Marcus glanced toward the front, and there he saw her Lydia Crane. Tall, impeccably composed. Corporate perfect smile. Her presence brought a tightening to the space, like she carried invisible authority wrapping the aisle in tension. She scanned the cabin with a practiced eye before spotting him. Her expression didn't shift, but something in her posture did a slight lift of the chin, a professionalism sharpened by something colder. Before she reached him, she paused at row 1 and greeted someone with a voice that was far too polite to be spontaneous. "Mr. Merrick, welcome aboard. We're honored to have you flying with us again." There he was, Colin Merrick, tall, handsome in a polished, almost artificial way, a tech billionaire whose face appeared on magazine covers and investment podcasts. He didn't acknowledge Lydia with warmth. He didn't smile. He simply gave a curt nod, The caned men gave when they believed acknowledgement was a gift. He carried no bags, someone else carried those behind him. He didn't check his seat number. He didn't need to. Men like him assumed the world would guide them to the best seat available. Marcus watched Merrick settle into 3C, the aisle seat across from him. He looked around as if surveying property he might purchase. Marcus returned his eyes to the window. He had no interest in the man. No interest in the orbit of whispers following him. No interest in the subtle shift in crew behavior that seemed to encircle him with privilege. But he did feel a ripple of something else, protectiveness. A quiet, firm resolve that if tonight became one of those nights, if someone looked at him the way they did years ago, he would not shrink, he would not fold. He wasn't 22 anymore. He was Marcus Hale. He took a long, slow breath. The jet bridge door thumped as it began to retract. The flight crew performed their silent checks. A faint hum vibrated through the floor. Yet something inside Marcus whispered, "Not yet. Not quiet." Something was coming. Then Lydia stepped toward him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, voice smooth, almost too smooth. "May I have a quick word with you regarding your seat?" Marcus turned to her gently, calmly. He felt it. The thread pulling loose. The night beginning to bend. Whatever was coming next, he would face it with the steadiness he'd earned through every hardship of his life. This was the moment before the moment. The breath before the storm. Lydia Crane stood with perfect posture, hands clasped lightly at her waist, as though even the smallest movement had been rehearsed. Under the soft cabin lights, her uniform looked crisp enough to crack. The way she leaned toward Marcus wasn't confrontational, not yet, but it carried an undercurrent he recognized instantly. A request that wasn't really a request. "Sir," she said, her voice smooth as a practiced smile. "May I speak with you for a moment about your seat?" Marcus lifted his eyes slowly. "Of course." She gestured lightly toward the empty space near the bulkhead, not far from where Merrick's assistants were fussing over his jacket. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. He kept his expression neutral, his body unhurried. Years of experience taught him a simple truth: the calmer he was, the easier it became to see what people were trying to hide. They stepped aside, not far, just enough so the conversation could feel private, but still very much within earshot of whoever wanted to listen. Lydia offered a polite smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you for your time, Mr." She glanced briefly at his boarding pass. "Mr. Hale?" Marcus nodded. "Yes." She clasped her hands. "One of our priority passengers has a particular seating requirement tonight. We're hoping you might be willing to switch to another seat in business class. The location is still premium, of course. Just a different row." The words were soft, polished, practiced, but underneath, Marcus heard what wasn't being said. "This seat is meant for someone more important than you." His gaze remained steady. "I chose 3A for a reason. Is something wrong with my ticket?" "Oh, no," Lydia said quickly. "Not at all. Nothing wrong. It's simply that Mr. Merrick, our VIP, requires this specific seat for comfort and accessibility." Marcus let that settle. Accessibility. She blinked. Just once. Yes. He tilted his head slightly, not challenging, just curious. "He seems perfectly mobile." Lydia drew in a tiny breath, subtle but noticeable. "It's not about mobility, sir. It's about ensuring our top-tier passengers receive the experience they've earned. We do hope all our guests can cooperate with these occasional adjustments." There it was. A familiar sting. Too familiar. Marcus nodded slowly, thoughtfully. "I'm sure you understand my question, then. Why this seat specifically?" Her polished smile tightened at the edges. "It's simply our discretion." "Sir." Marcus didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't break eye contact. "Lydia," he said gently. Does your discretion override my purchased reservation? Her throat tightened. Barely perceptible. But real. A small pause lingered between them, thickening the air. Before she could answer, a voice broke through from behind them. Lydia Colin Merrick. His tone carried the kind of impatience that suggested he wasn't used to waiting not for anyone, and certainly not for a dispute he hadn't already won. He stepped closer, his presence heavy with assumption. "What's the holdup?" Merrick asked. "I thought we sorted the seating issue." Lydia gave him a reassuring look. "We're resolving it now." "Mr. Merrick." Merrick turned to Marcus with a polite, hollow smile. "Sir, I'm sure you don't mind switching seats. I need the window. Helps me sleep. And honestly, we all want to take off on time. Don't we?" Marcus studied him for a moment. Merrick wasn't rude, not overtly, but his tone held the quiet arrogance of someone who'd never considered that another person's needs could equal his own. To him, everything was an exchange authority for compliance, money for comfort, reputation for deference. Marcus kept his voice warm, almost gentle. "Does the airline routinely reassign passengers at another customer's request?" The billionaire's smile faded. "Look, let's not make this complicated. They know who I am. I fly this airline more times a year than most people breathe fresh air. They'll take care of me." Marcus inhaled slowly. He wasn't surprised. Not really. But something in his chest tightened an old bruise pressed by a new hand. When he was younger, he would have complied. Not because he agreed, but because the fight never seemed worth it. Back then, the world taught him smallness long before it taught him dignity. But tonight, he felt something steadier inside him, something anchored. "I'm not interested in status," Marcus said softly. "Only fairness." Merrick's jaw shifted. Fairness. This is how things work. If you're in the way, someone moves you. It's not personal. It's priority. He said it casually, naturally, as though it were a fundamental law of physics. Marcus turned slightly toward Lydia. "Is that the airline's position as well?" For the first time, Lydia faltered. Her lips parted, but words didn't arrive. Marcus waited. And waiting, he'd learned, could be powerful. It forced truth to step into the quiet. She swallowed. "Sir, the seat change would help us ensure a smooth boarding process. That's all." Marcus met her eyes, a calm, steady gaze that held neither anger nor accusation. "Then you should tell me which regulation gives you the authority to reassign my confirmed seat for another passenger's convenience." Her breath caught. He continued gently, almost kindly. "I ask because I'm familiar with FAA directives, and with your airline's contract of carriage. Neither contains a clause allowing reassignment of a fully paid seat to accommodate status." Something flickered across her face. Fear, frustration, uncertainty. Before she could respond, Merrick stepped forward. "Look," he said sharply, "I don't have time for legal talk. Call your supervisor, or security. Whatever gets this moving." Lydia stiffened at his tone, then turned back to Marcus with a strained quiet. "Sir, please understand. We truly need your cooperation." Marcus let the silence breathe for a moment. He didn't want to embarrass her. He didn't want to escalate anything. But he felt the weight of all the unspoken times people like him had been expected to quietly give up their place. He chose his words carefully. "I understand you're doing your job," he said softly. "But I won't give up my seat. Not unless there's a legitimate safety requirement." Lydia's shoulders lowered, defeated but still trying to maintain professionalism. Merrick huffed. Unbelievable. Marcus ignored him. He wasn't defending a chair. He was defending the simple truth that dignity didn't come stamped on a boarding pass. When he returned to his seat, he felt the energy around him shift. Some passengers pretended not to listen, but their glances betrayed curiosity. A few nodded subtly his way. One woman mouthed, "Good for you." Marcus didn't acknowledge any of it. He just sat down, buckled his seatbelt, and looked out the window. The wing reflected the red glow of the gate lights. Static. Still. Nothing unusual. Yet something in his chest felt unsettled. A sense that tonight wasn't done testing him. He breathed deeply, steady and slow. Outside, a maintenance truck rolled past, its headlights sweeping a soft, distorted reflection across the paneling of the wing. And for a brief second, just one, Marcus thought he saw the surface bend in a way it shouldn't. He blinked. The moment passed. But a whisper in his instincts stirred. Something wasn't right. And soon, the night would prove him correct. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Passengers continued boarding, dragging soft-sided carry-ons, adjusting their coats, greeting each other with quiet small talk. The overhead bins clicked shut one by one. A child laughed somewhere in row 7. Someone coughed near the galley. Everything looked normal, but normal is fragile. It can crack without warning. Marcus sat motionless, his gaze drifting between the aisle and the faint reflection of the wing outside. He didn't want trouble. He never did. But trouble had a habit of finding people who refused to shrink. And tonight, he simply wouldn't shrink. Across the aisle. Colin Merrick scrolled his phone with the impatience of a man who believed time owed him interest. His assistants kept glancing between Marcus and Lydia, as if waiting for something decisive to happen. Then came the sound, sharp, brisk footsteps moving down the aisle. Not Lydia's. Heavier. More authoritative. Marcus looked up. The purser had arrived, a tall man in his mid-40s, built like someone who once played college football but traded the jersey for a corporate smile. His name badge read, Daniel Ford, Cabin Manager. His face held that familiar expression people in customer-facing authority often wore, polite on the surface, irritated beneath, certain he already knew the conclusion of the conversation. "Mr. Hale?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "Yes." Daniel clasped his hands behind his back, posture rigid. "I understand there's been some difficulty regarding your seat assignment," Marcus replied calmly. "No difficulty on my part. I'm in the seat I paid for." Daniel inhaled slowly, a controlled breath. "Well," he said, voice professional but clipped, "we have a situation tonight. Our priority guest requires this particular seat." "Why?" Marcus asked gently. Daniel blinked, thrown off by the softness of the question. "It's a matter of, well, preference." "Preference," Marcus repeated, as if tasting the word, not safety, not accessibility, preference. A flicker of annoyance crossed Daniel's face. "Sir, we're trying to avoid delaying the flight. Cooperation would help everyone else get where they need to go." The subtext was loud, even though the words were quiet. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Don't inconvenience people more important than you." Merrick leaned back in his seat, watching with a smug detachment as though the outcome was already certain, as though the world had always pivoted toward him with minimal effort. Marcus kept his voice low, gentle, controlled. "I understand your desire to keep things on schedule," he said, "but your airline can't reassign a paid seat for another customer's convenience, not without clear safety justification." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Sir, I need you to understand something. This is a directive from the cabin crew. Failure to comply may be considered a disruption." The word disruption hung in the air like a warning bell. Marcus felt it hit him not the threat itself, but the implication behind it. He'd seen enough incidents in the news to know where language like that often led for men who looked like him. But fear wasn't what settled in his chest. It was sadness, that even after all his work, all his accomplishments, someone still looked at him and saw a problem instead of a person. He spoke softly. "Daniel, I'm not disrupting anything. I'm sitting in my assigned seat. I simply won't surrender it to accommodate someone else's status." A few passengers turned, listening now, not openly, but subtly enough that Marcus felt the weight of their attention. "For God's sake," Merrick finally snapped. "Is this really happening?" his assistants murmured to each other, clearly annoyed. Marcus ignored them. He kept his eyes on Daniel, the man who had the power to escalate everything or de-escalate it with one simple choice. Then came the moment that broke the thin layer of calm. Daniel leaned closer, his tone dropping to a whisper meant to carry authority. "Sir, if you don't move voluntarily, I may have to request law enforcement to intervene." The air shifted sharply. Passengers stiffened. The cabin froze for one suspended beat. Marcus didn't move, didn't flinch. His voice remained steady, almost tender. "Call them if you must, but make sure your report is accurate. Tell them I remained seated. Tell them I asked for the specific regulation that allows you to remove me for another passenger's preference. Tell them I asked politely." Daniel's jaw tightened. A flush crept up his neck. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. He expected resistance. Yes, but the calm kind unsettled him. The kind backed by knowledge, experience, and something harder to topple than compliance. Authority disliked steadiness. It preferred chaos. Chaos was easier to blame. Marcus exhaled quietly. "And Daniel, please understand something before you make that call." A pause. "I know the law." Daniel's throat worked as he swallowed, eyes flicking toward the front of the plane, toward Lydia, toward Merrick, toward the complexity unfolding around him. He wasn't just fighting Marcus. He was fighting optics, rules, the fear of making the wrong decision under someone else's pressure, and Merrick definitely applied pressure. "Lydia," Merrick barked, "why are we still talking? Resolve this." His impatience made her flinch. Marcus caught the tiny movement. It softened him in a way he didn't expect. Sometimes the people enforcing unfairness were just afraid to do otherwise. He turned to Lydia and spoke quietly. "I don't hold this against you." She froze, not expecting kindness, not deserving of blame, but caught somewhere in the middle. Marcus sat back as Daniel straightened again, before he could issue another demand. Another voice entered the conversation, this time from behind. A middle-aged woman in row 4 raised her hand slightly. "Excuse me," she said, calmly. "He's right. The airline can't make him give up his seat just because someone has more miles." Her husband nodded. "We travel a lot. This isn't policy." More passengers chimed in quietly. Not loud, not confrontational, just enough to shift the balance. The quiet crowd had chosen a side, and it wasn't Merrick's. Merrick scoffed dramatically. "This is ridiculous. Are we seriously letting a cabin full of amateurs dictate procedure?" Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. The people around him were answering for him now. Daniel dragged a hand over his face. Conflict flickered behind his eyes. Duty, ego, pressure, confusion. Finally, he nodded once, slowly. "I'll speak with the captain," he said. "Please remain seated for now." He walked away, tension thick in every step. Marcus returned to his seat, his pulse steady. He'd navigated courtroom battles more intense than this. Hostile negotiations, federal hearings, discrimination dressed in expensive suits, but something about this moment felt heavier. Maybe because it wasn't a professional fight, maybe because it was personal in a way only strangers could make it. He looked out the window again. The wing shimmered under the lights. A faint reflection glided across its surface, bending strangely along one of the composite panels. He frowned. There it was again, that momentary distortion he'd caught earlier. He narrowed his eyes, leaning closer to the glass. Something on that wing didn't look right. Not structurally, not for a plane about to cross the eastern seaboard at 540 miles per hour. The arguments in the cabin were fading. But the real danger was just beginning. And Marcus, against every plan he had for the night, was about to be pulled into something far larger than a seating dispute. He didn't know it yet, but the flight would never leave the ground. Daniel Ford's footsteps faded toward the front of the cabin, leaving behind a tension so thick it hummed under the overhead lights. Passengers tried to pretend they weren't watching, but every movement carried a quiet stiffness, heads tilted subtly, shoulders angled toward Marcus, breaths held just a second too long. Marcus didn't look at anyone. He kept his gaze on the wing outside, the faint distortion still echoing in his mind like a distant alarm. He wasn't certain yet uncertainty was dangerous at 30,000 feet, but he knew enough to feel uneasy. Danger never introduced itself loudly. It whispered first. A shadow moved across the aisle. Colin Merrick. The billionaire stood, straightened his suit jacket, and stepped closer to Marcus's seat, blocking the view of several passengers who leaned in instinctively. He folded his arms, leaning slightly into Marcus's personal space. "You're really going to drag this out, aren't you?" he said, voice low but laced with irritation. Marcus shifted his attention to him. His expression remained calm, his posture relaxed. But there was a steadiness in his eyes that made Merrick hesitate for half a heartbeat. "I'm not dragging anything out," Marcus answered softly. "I'm just staying where I belong." Merrick scoffed, glancing around at the passengers. "Where you belong. Don't flatter yourself. This seat isn't about belonging. It's about priority, about status. That's how the world works." Marcus turned to him fully now. His voice remained gentle. So gentle it unsettled more than anger ever could. "Maybe that's how your world works," Marcus said, "but not mine." Merrick leaned in closer. "My world is the one that pays for flights like this, keeps airlines running, keeps airports operating. Without people like me, half of these folks wouldn't even be able to fly." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Lydia, standing mid-aisle, closed her eyes briefly, pained by the sound of Merrick's arrogance echoing off the very walls she worked so hard to maintain. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm sure you help many things keep running," Marcus said quietly, "but that doesn't give you the right to move people like pieces on a board." A muscle twitched in Merrick's jaw. "You think this is some moral high ground? It's simple. You're in my seat, and I'm giving you a chance to step aside gracefully." There was an unmistakable subtext in his tone. A black man taking a seat a rich white billionaire expected for himself. Marcus felt the old, familiar ache again, the one he'd buried beneath years of hard work and harder lessons. He heard echoes of strangers telling him, "Not here," "Not you," "Wrong place," "Wrong seat." He pushed the ache down. "I'm not stepping aside," Marcus murmured. "Not for you. Not for anyone. Not when I've done nothing wrong." Merrick's eyes flashed. "Then I'll make sure security drags you off this plane. And trust me, it won't look good on you." Not for someone who he stopped. Maybe he'd gone too far. Maybe he saw the ripple of shock among nearby passengers. Or maybe he realized the weight of the threat he'd almost spoken aloud. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink, didn't break his calm. "You don't know anything about me," he said softly. Merrick opened his mouth, but a sharp voice cut through the space. "Mr. Merrick, please take your seat." Daniel Ford was back, breath tight, tension wrapped around his words. He looked shaken, though, whether it was from speaking with the captain or realizing how quickly the situation was spiraling. Marcus couldn't tell. Merrick glared at him. Well, Daniel cleared his throat. "The captain is asking for patience while we review a potential issue. He needs a moment. A potential issue." Merrick repeated, "What does that even mean?" "We need to leave." Daniel hesitated. "It's a safety matter." That changed everything. Safety. Passengers straightened. Whispering began. Lydia moved closer to the galley, exchanging worried glances with the young attendant. Merrick's impatience deepened, but even he knew when to stop pushing aircraft safety wasn't something one could bulldoze with arrogance. "What issue?" Merrick asked sharply. Daniel flicked a quick look at Marcus. Marcus didn't speak. He remained silent, quietly folding his hands. Daniel cleared his throat again. "One of our passengers reported something unusual on the wing." More whispers erupted now. Several people leaned toward the windows, though from their angle they couldn't see anything. Merrick whipped his head back toward Marcus. You did this. It's my legal obligation to report anything unusual," Marcus said, "just as it's their duty to check." "That's ridiculous," Merrick snapped. "You're not qualified." Marcus looked at him gently. "You don't know what I'm qualified to do." That line hit harder than he intended. Merrick stared, unable to form a quick retort. Before he could recover, Daniel gestured toward the front of the plane. "I'll return with an update shortly." He said, "Please remain seated." He left again. Lydia followed him halfway, stopping only when Daniel whispered something she didn't want to hear. Her face paled. Marcus leaned back slowly. He wasn't proud of being right. He didn't even know if he was right yet. His instincts told him something was wrong. The shimmer, the subtle bending of the composite panel, those weren't illusions. He'd seen similar distortions before in his investigations. Sometimes they were harmless. Sometimes they weren't. But in aviation, sometimes was a gamble no one should take. He looked out the window again. The wing seemed to breathe under the lights, flexed in a way that felt wrong. Too soft, too uneven, too familiar. Memories rose up, uninvited images of a fuselage panel he inspected after a mid-air decompression accident years ago. The way it had peeled, piece by piece. The sound of a grieving mother during the inquiry. Marcus inhaled deeply. He could hope he was wrong. But hope wasn't safety. The aisle trembled slightly as someone approached. Lydia. But this time she didn't stand tall or rigid. Her posture softened, shoulders lowered, expression unsettled. When she reached Marcus, she spoke in a quiet tone, careful not to draw attention. "Mr. Hale," she said gently, "the captain has requested additional information about what you saw." Marcus nodded. "Of course." Her eyes drifted to the window, just briefly. There was fear in her gaze, not of him, but of what he might confirm. "What exactly did you notice?" she asked. Marcus kept his voice soft, steady. "The composite panel just forward of the leading edge seems to flex under light pressure. It shouldn't. It could be structural fatigue, or an improper patch, or—" He paused. "Or a rushed repair." Lydia's face tightened. She whispered, "We had some maintenance work done earlier today." Marcus nodded. He already suspected as much. Lydia swallowed. "Do you think it's serious?" Marcus looked out the window again. He didn't want to scare her. He didn't want to scare anyone. But the truth didn't need permission. "I think it needs to be checked," he said quietly, thoroughly. She nodded, her breath trembling. "Thank you." As she stepped away, Merrick let out an audible groan. "This is absurd," he muttered loudly. "A plane gets grounded because one guy thinks he saw something." Marcus turned his head slowly. "If one guy sees something, the responsible thing is to check." Merrick shook his head. "I swear, this is unbelievable." Marcus responded with the same gentle steadiness that had carried him through the entire ordeal. "What's unbelievable," he said softly, "is how upset you are at the idea of making sure everyone gets home alive." The passengers around them went silent, not tense, not fearful, just struck by the weight of truth. Merrick slumped into his seat, muttering something under his breath about schedules and incompetence. Marcus took another quiet breath and looked back out the window. The wing shimmered again. The night was far from over, and the real confrontation hadn't even begun. The cabin had shifted into a brittle, fragile calm, not peaceful, just quiet in the way a room gets quiet before a difficult truth is spoken. Passengers sat straighter, glanced sideways, breathed a little slower. Even the fans hummed with a low, steady tension. Then the cockpit door opened. A figure stepped out. The air seemed to tighten around him. Captain Elias Grant, a tall man with silvering hair, deep-set eyes, and the kind of quiet authority earned through decades of flying. His uniform was crisp, but his expression carried the weight of someone who'd seen enough airborne emergencies to treat every concern seriously, no matter the source. Marcus noticed immediately Grant wasn't irritated. He wasn't impatient. He wasn't approaching with assumptions already made. He was listening before a single word was spoken. That alone eased something in Marcus. A small thing, but small things mattered. All eyes followed the captain as he walked slowly down the aisle toward seat 3A. Daniel Ford and Lydia Crane flanked him, like anxious shadows. Merrick straightened, prepared to deliver his grievances with all the exhaustion of a man who expected the world to side with him. But Captain Grant didn't look at Merrick, not even once. He approached Marcus directly. "Mr. Hale," he said in a calm, steady voice. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus nodded. "Of course." "Captain." Grant gestured toward the open space near the galley, and Marcus stood, moving slowly to avoid unsettling the other passengers. His steps were measured, his posture collected. He had fought battles in courtrooms far colder than this. But something about the stakes here, human lives suspended above the Atlantic, placed a weight in his chest that no lawsuit ever had. When they reached the galley, the captain folded his hands. "I understand you've reported a concern regarding the left wing," Grant said. Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir. I'd like to hear exactly what you observed." Marcus chose his words carefully, not dramatic, not vague, clear, precise. The way he spoke when every detail mattered. "I saw flecks in the composite panel near the forward section of the leading edge," Marcus said. "It happened when the maintenance truck's lights passed over it. The reflection bent unnaturally, as if the surface wasn't fully bonded." Grant's expression barely shifted, but something sharpened in his eyes. "Do you have experience with composite failures?" he asked. Marcus nodded once. "I worked on a case involving an in-flight decompression caused by a faulty composite repair. I've also reviewed several NTSB investigations tied to similar issues." A slow breath escaped the captain. He wasn't doubting. He was calculating. "What else did you see?" Grant asked. "There was a brief shimmer earlier." Marcus added, "It could have been nothing, but combined with the flexing panel, it's worth checking." Grant looked past Marcus toward the wing, though from this angle he couldn't see it clearly. Still, his mind was already ahead reviewing structural schematics, imagining load distribution at altitude, running through worst-case scenarios only seasoned pilots ever let themselves imagine. "Thank you," Grant said finally. Just 2 words, but they landed with sincerity. Merrick, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward abruptly, irritation radiating off him like heat. "Captain, with all due respect, this is getting out of hand. We have a schedule to keep. I've already missed 1 meeting today. We don't need to check every shadow because a passenger thinks he's an engineer." The captain turned to him very slowly. "I didn't ask for your opinion, Mr. Merrick." The billionaire blinked, stunned. Grant faced him fully. "And let me be perfectly clear," the captain continued, voice still calm but firm. "If a single passenger expresses a concern that could potentially compromise the safety of this aircraft, I am required legally and ethically to investigate it thoroughly, whether they are a silver-tier member, a platinum-tier member, or someone flying for the very first time." Merrick deflated slightly, the blow to his ego visible in the way his posture sagged a fraction. But his pride was stubborn. But surely the captain cut him off with a raised hand. "This is not a negotiation." Silence. Then Grant turned back to Marcus. "I've requested the ground engineering crew return to the aircraft for a second inspection," he said. "But before they arrive, I'd like you to help me pinpoint the exact location you saw the distortion." Marcus blinked, surprised. "Of course. Whatever you need." Grant nodded and motioned toward the window seats. "Let's take a closer look. Together." They moved to 3A. Passengers watched in thick silence. Merrick glared but said nothing. Lydia's hands shook slightly as she clasped them along her apron. Daniel Ford remained stone-faced, though tension carved itself into the lines of his jaw. Marcus leaned toward the window. The wing glowed beneath the bright tarmac floodlights, its white surface reflecting clean, sharp lines. Everything looked normal, perfect, even. But Marcus shook his head. "Give it a moment," he murmured. As if responding to his words, a maintenance cart rolled past. This time, its headlights swept slowly across the wing, creating a smooth, gliding reflection. Until there it was, a ripple, a subtle bending of light across the forward composite panel. Almost nothing. But to someone who'd seen the aftermath of almost nothing, it was enough. Marcus pointed. "Right there." Grant leaned down, face close to the glass, following the path of Marcus's finger. The light hit the same spot, a faint shimmer, a distortion, the quiet suggestion of weakness. The captain exhaled sharply. "Jesus," he whispered. Only Marcus heard it. Grant straightened. He pulled his radio from his belt. "This is the captain," he said. "Secure the aircraft. We need ground crew and engineering at the left wing immediately." Passengers stiffened. Whispers rippled down the aisles. Marcus remained calm, but his chest tightened. Not with fear, fear had no space here, but with the heavy burden of responsibility. He hadn't wanted to be right, not about this. Merrick shot up from his seat. "You're grounding the flight over a panel reflection." "Are you serious?" Grant faced him again. "Mr. Merrick," he said sternly, "what you just witnessed is a potential structural anomaly. At 35,000 feet, a small failure becomes a catastrophic one. I will not gamble with a single life on this aircraft." Merrick's face contorted, torn between pride and the creeping realization that he might have been very wrong. Passengers exchanged looks, fear, gratitude, confusion. Lydia brought a hand to her chest, relief washing over her features. Daniel Ford closed his eyes in a slow, heavy acceptance. Grant returned the radio to his belt and addressed Marcus directly. "You may have just prevented something very serious," the captain said. Marcus nodded softly. "Thank you for listening." Grant held his gaze for a long, meaningful moment. Not listening would have been the mistake. The captain walked briskly toward the cockpit to coordinate with maintenance crews gathering outside. Through the window, Marcus could see engineers approaching the wing with high-powered lights and inspection tools. A quiet settled over the cabin, heavy, reflective, reverent. Passengers were no longer watching a dispute. They were watching a man who refused to move, and might have saved them all. Lydia approached Marcus slowly, voice trembling. "Mr. Hale," she whispered, I didn't realize." Marcus shook his head gently. "You were doing what you thought you had to." Tears filled her eyes, not from guilt alone, but from relief. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Marcus placed a soft hand on the armrest. "We're all learning." Merrick remained still in his seat, staring out the window at the engineers. For the first time that night, the billionaire looked small. Daniel exhaled a long, worn-out breath and sank onto the armrest of an empty seat. The weight of what almost happened, what could have happened, pressed visibly on him. Marcus looked outside one more time. The wing gleamed under the inspection lights. Engineers leaned in, frowning, pointing, confirming. And Marcus knew. long before anyone spoke a word. This flight was never going to take off. The engineers moved with the urgency of men who knew exactly what was at stake. Their reflective vests glowed under the tarmac lights as they circled the wing, crouched, inspected, and barked clipped instructions into handheld radios. Inside the cabin, the silence was thick enough to press against the chest. Passengers watched through narrow windows or tracked the movements with nervous glances, shifting in their seats, holding the armrests as if steadying themselves for news they weren't ready to hear. Marcus stayed seated at 3A, leaning slightly toward the window, not in fear, not in triumph, but in a quiet, painful mixture of responsibility and relief. He didn't want to be right, but he wanted the truth seen. Across the aisle, Merrick's expression had collapsed into something tighter, smaller, uncertain. The bravado that had carried him earlier had drained into the reality now unfolding on the tarmac. The captain returned to the cabin doorway and watched the engineers from a distance. His arms were crossed, jaw tense, eyes narrowed with the practiced intuition of someone who could read bad news before a single word reached his ears. Then it happened. A small flashlight beam swept across the panel Marcus had pointed out, and suddenly the engineer holding it froze. He leaned closer, pressed his hand to the panel, pulled it away, looked again. Another engineer hurried over. They spoke quickly, urgently. Moments later, the lead engineer stepped back, raised his radio, and said something into it that made the captain straighten sharply in the doorway. The truth was out. Captain Grant walked back down the aisle, calm but grim, and approached Marcus. "Mr. Hale," he said quietly, "may I have a word?" Marcus stood. "Of course." They stepped toward the galley again. The passengers watched, but no one dared speak. Grant took a breath. The engineering team found a delamination under the composite panel, a significant one. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. He knew that term, knew it too well. Composite delamination wasn't cosmetic. It wasn't minor. It meant structural weakness. It meant instability under pressure. It meant that if the plane had taken off, the panel could have separated mid-flight, compromising lift and airflow and everything keeping the aircraft balanced. How severe, Marcus asked. Grant exhaled through his nose. Severe enough that the aircraft is grounded indefinitely. They're calling in a secondary inspection team to assess the rest of the wing. The captain looked him in the eyes. "You saw something no one else did," he said, "and you spoke up. That isn't something people do lightly." Marcus nodded. His throat tightened not with pride, but with the weight of what might have happened. "Thank you for believing me." Grant shook his head. "Thank you for paying attention." A beat passed. Then the captain stepped forward, addressing the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice steady but heavy, due to a verified structural anomaly on the left wing, Global Atlantic Flight 184 will not be departing tonight. For your safety, we must deplane and rebook all travelers. I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience, but the alternative was a risk I refused to take. Silence. Then a wave of stunned exhalations, a few gasps, a quiet, "Oh my God," near row 9. Merrick slumped backward in his seat, face pale. His assistants exchanged horrified glances. Lydia covered her mouth with both hands, tears gathering in her eyes. Passengers didn't cheer. Not yet. The fear was still too fresh, the realization still too raw. They'd all been sitting on a disaster, waiting to happen. Marcus felt a hand brush his arm. It was the middle-aged woman from row 4, the one who had spoken up earlier. Her eyes were glassy. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved us." Her husband nodded tightly, adding, "We had no idea." A young man behind them chimed in softly. "You did the right thing." Man, most people wouldn't have bothered. More murmurs followed. Appreciation, relief, guilt, recognition, not loud, not showy, just honest. Lydia approached slowly, hands still trembling. "Mr. Hale." Her voice cracked. "I should have listened earlier. I'm so sorry." Marcus gave her a small, gentle nod. "You listened when it mattered." She swallowed hard, tears spilling down, not from humiliation but from understanding. Merrick stood abruptly. His voice wavered not with anger, but with something foreign to him, uncertainty. "You really saw that from the window?" he asked, breath thin. Marcus held his gaze. "I noticed something, and I didn't ignore it." Merrick's mouth opened, then closed. The words were there, but pride strangled them. Not apology, not yet. Just the awareness that for once, his money hadn't given him control. Daniel Ford stepped forward now. He looked exhausted, defeated, but also clearer. "Mr. Hale," he said softly, "I misjudged you. This whole time, I thought you were being difficult, but you were trying to keep everyone safe." Marcus nodded gently. "We all want to get home. That's all." Daniel nodded, shame and gratitude mixing in his expression. "I'll remember this." The captain began organizing the deplaning process, coordinating with gate agents and security. But the passengers didn't rush for the door. Many lingered, staring at Marcus, absorbing what almost happened. As the engineers continued their work outside, Marcus gazed through the window. One technician peeled back a section of the composite to reveal the truth underneath a web-like separation, dark and unnatural, spreading like a bruise under the surface. A fault invisible to everyone but the one man who knew what to look for. He whispered under his breath, "That could have cost a lot of people their lives." The young flight attendant approached Marcus with wide, shaken eyes. "Is it true?" she whispered. Would it really have been that dangerous? Marcus didn't sugarcoat. At altitude? Yes. She blinked hard. I don't know how you saw it. There's a difference," Marcus said softly, "between looking at something and noticing it." She nodded, absorbing the lesson deeper than she expected. As the passengers began gathering their belongings, a ripple of applause slowly spread from the back of the aircraft. Not loud, not performative, just a steady, heartfelt appreciation. It grew gently, filling the cabin with a warmth that contrasted the cold fear from earlier. People nodded to Marcus as they passed him. "Thank you. You saved my family. We owe you, sir. You did good." And Marcus accepted none of it with pride, only humility. Because he hadn't done it for glory. He'd done it because paying attention was part of who he was. The last person to approach him before deplaning was the captain. Grant extended his hand. "Mr. Hale," he said quietly. "Thank you. And I mean that on behalf of every soul on this plane." Marcus shook his hand. "You acted decisively, Captain. That's what saved them." Grant gave a small, appreciative smile. "Maybe so, but you were the one who saw the first sign." As Marcus stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air of the terminal washed over him. Lighter, cleaner, free of the tension that had tightened his chest for the last hour. Behind him, the damaged aircraft sat under the bright lights of the tarmac, no longer a vessel for flight, but a reminder of how close they'd come. He walked forward, not with triumph, but with the quiet strength of someone who refused to be moved, and in doing so, saved everyone else. The jet bridge felt colder than the cabin, an unfiltered rush of airport air that carried echoes of late-night announcements and distant rolling suitcases. Passengers walked slowly, almost reverently, as if stepping away from something sacred and dangerous at the same time. Marcus Hale moved with the stream but not in the stream. He walked quietly, thoughtfully, feeling each step like a return to gravity. He glanced over his shoulder one last time. Through the rectangular window of the jet bridge, the grounded aircraft sat under a halo of amber tarmac lights. The engineers were still there, focused, deliberate, working with urgency rather than routine. One of them was kneeling on a scissor lift, removing an access panel near the left wing root. Another was photographing the delamination up close. A plane that nearly carried disaster into the night now lay exposed, honest, unable to hide its flaws beneath smooth white paint. Marcus exhaled. Sometimes truth was ugly, sometimes necessary, and sometimes life-saving. He stepped into the terminal where a cluster of tired passengers began gathering near the podium, waiting for rebooking instructions. Gate agents were scrambling, phones ringing non-stop, supervisors hurrying in with clipboards and strained smiles. It wasn't chaos yet, but the edges were fraying. Marcus found a quiet corner near a window overlooking the vast Newark runway. He leaned against the cool glass, feeling the weight of the night settle across his shoulders. He had wanted a quiet flight, just a ride across the ocean, a few hours of rest. Instead, he'd become the protective wall between 184 lives and an invisible threat. He ran a hand down his face, exhaustion finally catching up with him. "Mr. Hale," a voice said gently. Marcus turned. It was the young flight attendant, the one who'd first offered him water at the very beginning of the night. Her name tag read Emily Saunders. Her eyes held a softness that contrasted sharply with the strain in the rest of her posture. "Are you all right?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Just tired." "You handled yourself with incredible grace," she said quietly. "I don't think I've ever seen someone stay that calm while being treated so unfairly." Marcus gave a small, weary smile. Sometimes calm is the only power you have. Emily looked down, fidgeting with her gloved hands. "If you hadn't spoken up, we would have taken off." Marcus didn't respond. The truth of that sentence hurt more than he expected. Emily swallowed. "Can I ask something?" "Of course." "How did you know what to look for? I mean, nobody else noticed anything." Marcus looked out the window at the grounded aircraft. "Experience," he said softly, "and a bit of luck." Emily studied him with a quiet admiration. "Well, I'm grateful for both." Before Marcus could say more, he heard raised voices near the podium. "Colin Merrick." "Of course." The billionaire stood in front of the counter, one hand braced on the desk, the other gesturing sharply. His voice wasn't angry, it was frantic, desperate in the way only men unused to losing control could be. "I don't care if you're trying your best," Merrick snapped. "I need to be in London by morning. Get me a flight, a private charter, anything." The agent, a young man barely in his 20s, looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. "Sir, all international departures are full for the night. There's nothing until the morning." "That's unacceptable," Merrick hissed. Marcus watched quietly. Not with satisfaction, not even with judgment, just with the quiet understanding that some people crumble when their world stops bending around them. Suddenly, Merrick's eyes found Marcus across the terminal, a flash of something resentment, shame, maybe both crossed the billionaire's face. He hesitated, then strode toward Marcus with stiff, fast steps. Emily tensed beside him. Merrick stopped a few feet away. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It wasn't arrogant. It wasn't even steady. "You really believe you saved everyone tonight?" he asked. Marcus held his gaze. "That's not why I spoke up." Something in Merrick's face trembled. I had a meeting that could have." He stopped himself, reconsidered, began again. "Do you know what I lost because of this?" Marcus felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. Merrick wanted pity, or justification, or someone to blame. But he didn't need any of those things. He needed perspective. "Colin," Marcus said softly, "what you almost lost is far greater than any meeting." Merrick's lips parted, but no words came. "You're frustrated," Marcus continued gently. "But frustration is a luxury the dead don't have." Merrick blinked hard, forcing down emotion that had nowhere to go. Emily watched in quiet awe. Marcus didn't lecture. He didn't scold. He simply held a mirror to the truth. A long silence passed. "Finally," Merrick whispered, "I didn't see it." "Any of it?" "It wasn't your job to see it," Marcus said, "but it was mine." Merrick frowned. "Yours, but your Marcus waited." For once, Merrick realized the weight of his words before speaking them. "I mean," he stumbled, "you didn't say you were." Marcus took a slow breath. "I'm a CEO," he said quietly. "I'm also an aviation law consultant, and a father, and a man who pays attention to the world he travels through." Merrick's shoulders slumped. "I shouldn't have talked to you like that." "No," Marcus said softly. "You shouldn't have." The billionaire swallowed hard, humiliation mixing with something more human this time. I'm not good at apologizing," Merrick admitted. "I noticed," Marcus replied gently. For the first time, Merrick gave a faint, broken laugh. They weren't friends. They weren't equals. But something between them shifted. Respect. Not yet, but recognition. "You did save us," Merrick murmured. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. As Merrick walked away, the tension in the air eased. Emily exhaled. "I've never seen someone talk him down like that." Marcus shook his head. "He talked himself down. I just didn't stop him." Emily smiled softly. "You're a good man, Mr. Hale." Marcus's expression grew distant. "Some days," he said quietly. "I'm just trying to be." The gate supervisor approached then, clipboard in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "Global Atlantic will be providing hotel accommodations for all passengers, along with meal vouchers. We appreciate your patience." People began lining up for rebooking assignments. Someone offered Marcus the chance to go first. He politely declined. He didn't want special treatment. Not now. Not for this. Instead, he walked toward the large glass windows overlooking the runway. Outside, the damaged aircraft sat like a wounded animal. Engineers surrounded it with tools and bright lights, exposing its flaw to the world so that nothing like this would ever be hidden again. Marcus rested a hand against the cool glass. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel heroic. He felt human. And tired. Very tired. He whispered under his breath, not a prayer, not a boast, but a quiet truth. Sometimes the only reason people survive is because someone refused to move. The airport at night had a strange kind of quiet, not true silence, but a softened hum, a lull between departures and delays, between exhaustion and relief. Marcus Hale walked through that quiet with a slow, steady stride, the rolling tension of the evening still clinging to his shoulders. He held the hotel voucher and rebooking slip loosely in one hand, though neither mattered to him now. He needed a moment, a breath, a place to sit with the reality of what had unfolded. The terminal's floor-to-ceiling windows stretched endlessly, reflecting rows of empty chairs and the cold glow of runway lights. Marcus found a bench near the end of the concourse, a quiet corner where he could finally let himself feel the weight of everything. He sat. For the first time since the confrontation began, he allowed himself to exhale without holding anything back. His heartbeat, which had remained steady during the chaos, now pulsed slower and heavier, like the body was finally processing what the mind had pushed aside. People walked past him, some still shaken, some whispering, some simply tired. Others glanced at him with gratitude or curiosity, but none approached. They sensed he needed space. He was grateful for that. Then a familiar voice broke the quiet. "Mr. Hale, do you have a moment?" Marcus looked up. Captain Elias Grant stood nearby, hat in hand, jacket unbuttoned, the strain of responsibility etched deep into his face. He looked older than he had an hour ago, more human, more burdened. Marcus sat up straight. Of course. Grant eased onto the bench beside him, leaving respectful space between them. For a moment he said nothing, just stared out the window at the crippled aircraft whose wings still shone under the bright lights of repair crews. "I've flown for 28 years, Grant finally said, and I've learned there are nights you don't forget. Tonight is one of them." Marcus nodded. "I imagine so." The captain's eyes followed the slow movement of an engineering lift. When they pulled back that composite layer, I felt my stomach drop. That kind of delamination. It could have sheared off mid-flight, and at our cruising altitude over the Atlantic, there wouldn't have been a chance. Marcus swallowed gently. "I'm sorry. I know this must be hard to hear." Grant shook his head. "No. I'm grateful. This crew is grateful. The passengers, whether they know it fully or not, owe their lives to your vigilance." Marcus looked down at his hands. "I wasn't trying to be a hero." "I know," Grant replied softly. "That's why it matters." The captain paused, choosing his words. "May I ask something?" "Of course," Grant turned to him. "When Lydia and Daniel pushed you to move seats, why didn't you push back harder? Why didn't you lose your temper?" Marcus stared at the runway lights, his voice growing quieter. "Because I've learned that raising your voice isn't the same as raising your dignity," he said, "and I've spent my whole life proving I belong in spaces people didn't expect me to be in." Grant listened with genuine respect. "There's a pressure," Marcus continued, "a pressure to never give anyone an excuse to call you unreasonable, or angry, or threatening. So you learn to breathe slower, sit straighter, speak softer." He paused, voice dipping. "It's exhausting sometimes." Grant's brows tightened with empathy. "I'm sorry you carry that." Marcus shook his head. "It's the world I grew up in. But tonight, I wasn't fighting them. I was fighting the pattern. The idea that status determines worth? That's not a lesson most people ever learn," Grant said quietly. Marcus let the silence settle. A moment later, a small figure appeared. Emily Saunders, the young flight attendant. She was holding 2 steaming cups of black coffee. "I, didn't know how you both take it," she said shyly. "So, it's just plain." Grant smiled softly and took one. "Thank you, Emily." Marcus accepted the other cup gently. "You didn't have to." "I know," she murmured. "That's why I wanted to." She lingered for a moment, hesitant. "Everything's going to be okay." "Right," Emily asked the captain. "The plane, it won't fly tomorrow." Grant shook his head firmly. "Not until we know exactly what caused the failure. No shortcuts, no exceptions." Emily nodded, reassured. Then her eyes drifted to Marcus, full of sincerity. "Thank you again, for all of us." Marcus gave her a warm, tired smile. "Get some rest, Emily." She left with a small nod, shoulders finally relaxing. Grant watched her go. "She's young," he said, "but she'll remember tonight for the rest of her career." Marcus took a sip of his coffee. It wasn't great, but it was grounding. A few seats away, he noticed a small family, the same couple from earlier, with a teenage daughter. The mother held her daughter close, whispering softly. The girl looked over at Marcus, offered a timid wave, and mouthed, "Thank you." Marcus returned a gentle nod. "Does it ever get easier?" he murmured. Grant followed his gaze. The responsibility, no. But the truth, yes, because it keeps people alive. Another silence, this one calmer. "Mr. Hale," Grant said after a moment, "I'd like to file a commendation report. For what you did. Passengers rarely speak up about things that don't concern them personally, let alone with such clarity." Marcus shook his head. "I don't need commendations." "I know you don't," Grant said, "but you deserve them. Just take care of your crew." Marcus replied. The captain smiled faintly. "Always." They sat there for a long moment, 2 men who understood responsibility in different ways. sharing the quiet aftermath of a near disaster. Eventually, Grant stood. "Get some rest, Mr. Hale. And thank you. Truly." Marcus watched him walk back toward the gate desk, where he began assisting his exhausted crew. The terminal had thinned out now. The noise softened. A few passengers slept against their carry-ons. Others waited quietly for their turn to receive lodging. Marcus remained seated on the bench, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm. He thought of his daughter, Liana, of how close he'd come tonight to never hearing her voice again, of how fragile the world could become in an instant. He pulled out his phone. This time, he didn't hesitate. He typed "delayed overnight." "Will explain tomorrow. Just wanted you to know, I'm safe. Love you." Liana replied within seconds. "Okay, Dad. Love you too. Please rest." He smiled. The simplest words were often the most healing. He leaned back, letting the fatigue finally wash over him fully. He had stood firm tonight, not out of pride, not out of stubbornness, but out of the quiet belief that a man had a right to his seat and the responsibility to notice when others were in danger. And because he refused to move, an entire flight would see tomorrow morning. The crew lounge of Gate C-17 felt colder than usual, not because of the air conditioning, but because no one inside dared to speak above a whisper. Lydia Crane sat rigidly at the long metal table, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Daniel Ford paced in slow, anxious steps behind her, rubbing the back of his neck. Their uniforms, usually a symbol of polished confidence, looked strangely heavy on them tonight. Across from them, Captain Elias Grant placed a thin folder on the table and sighed. The weight in his voice matched the weight in the air. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Lydia swallowed hard. Daniel stopped pacing. "I've submitted the preliminary incident report." Grant continued. "Engineering will issue their full findings tomorrow, but what they've already discovered is enough." No one breathed. Grant opened the folder, revealing photos of the wing under floodlights, close-up shots of the delaminated composite, the faint trail of hydraulic residue. The images alone told a story of how close they had come. "How long?" he asked gently. "Did the two of you see workers on that wing before boarding?" Daniel flinched. "It was maybe a minute," he muttered. "They looked like they were wiping something, and you didn't report it," Grant said. His tone wasn't harsh, but the disappointment cut deeper than anger ever could. "We thought it was cleaning," Lydia whispered. "Cleaning crew doesn't touch actuator housings," Grant said. "Never." Lydia closed her eyes. A tremor moved through her fingers. I just thought getting passengers seated quickly was the priority." Grant didn't answer right away. He let silence sit between them long enough that they felt it. Finally he spoke. "Safety is the priority," he said quietly. "It always has been. It always will be." Daniel stared at the floor. "Sir, if we had taken off, you don't need me to tell you what would have happened," Grant said. His voice softened, but the truth did not. "You already know." Lydia pressed a hand to her mouth. For the first time since the confrontation with Marcus Hale, she looked small, like someone suddenly aware of how fragile the world could be. Grant closed the folder. "I'm not here to assign punishment," he said. "That's for headquarters. But I want the truth from you. All of it." Neither of them spoke. Grant leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Did you pressure Mr. Hale because he was in the way? Or because you thought someone like him didn't belong in that seat Lydia's breath caught?" Daniel stiffened. "No," Lydia said quickly. I didn't think it wasn't personal." Grant didn't blink. "Are you sure?" Lydia stared at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. I don't know anymore." Her confession hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Daniel sank slowly into the chair beside her. It wasn't about race, sir. It was about the VIP list. We get pushed hard to accommodate top-tier names. You know how it is." Grant nodded. "I do. But you also know that a paying passenger with a confirmed seat cannot be downgraded for someone's ego." Daniel's shoulders slumped. Lydia whispered, "I thought I was being efficient. I didn't see him as a threat or a danger. I just didn't see him." Those words seemed to wound her as she spoke them. Captain Grant didn't judge. He simply listened because tonight wasn't just about a mechanical failure. It was about cracks in judgment, in empathy, in how people saw one another. "You know what struck me tonight?" he finally said. Mr. Hale never raised his voice. Not once. He stayed calm even when you didn't treat him fairly. And he still saved this flight. Both crew members lowered their heads. "That," Grant added softly, "is the kind of leadership we're supposed to have." Lydia's eyes welled. "I was wrong. I know that now." Grant softened. "Then learn from it. Because some mistakes you can fix. Others, you only get one chance." Daniel wiped his face with a trembling hand. "Sir, are we going to lose our jobs?" Grant hesitated. "I honestly don't know," he said gently. "But I do know this how you respond right now matters just as much as what you did earlier." Lydia nodded slowly. A gentle knock interrupted them. Emily Saunders poked her head into the room, voice soft. "Captain, they need you to sign off on the passenger compensation list." "I'll be right there," Grant said. Emily stepped inside, hesitant. "Is everything okay?" Grant rose, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're just having an honest conversation." She glanced at Lydia, and Daniel saw their red eyes and the emotional wreckage of the night. Her expression softened. "None of us were perfect tonight," Emily said. "But we can be better next time." "Right." Lydia gave a faint, grateful nod. Daniel exhaled shakily. Grant turned to the two senior crew members one last time. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be hard, but tonight, face the truth. It's the only way to move forward." He left the room with Emily. The door closed gently behind them. For a long moment, Lydia and Daniel remained silent. Then Lydia whispered, voice barely audible, "I almost sent a man to the back of the plane, and he ended up saving my life." Daniel stared at the table, eyes wet, "and I almost dismissed him, because someone richer wanted his seat. God." Lydia shook her head slowly. "Do you think he'll ever forgive us?" Daniel answered honestly. "I think he doesn't need to. He already moved on. It's us who have to face what we did." Lydia wiped her tears with the sleeve of her uniform. Daniel pressed his palms against his eyes. Both sat together in the quiet room, understanding at last the true meaning of the captain's words. Some failures break airplanes. Others break illusions. Either way, the only way out is through. And tonight, facing themselves hurt more than anything Marcus Hale had said. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows of the terminal, casting pale gold reflections across the polished floors. Travelers hurried in every direction, dragging suitcases behind them like tired shadows. Announcements echoed over the speakers, flight updates, gate changes, boarding calls, but underneath all that noise, a quieter tension pulsed through the building. The story had begun to spread. Passengers who witnessed the confrontation whispered in small groups. Some watched the replays on their phones. Others scrolled through shaky videos, recorded the previous night videos of Colin Merrick shouting, of Marcus Hale refusing to move, of Captain Grant calling for immediate inspection. And then, the still frames of engineers examining the damaged wing. Within hours, posts had gone viral. Man in 2A saves entire flight. Black CEO stands his ground, discovers deadly aircraft flaw. Privilege meets integrity in one unforgettable moment. Every headline carried some version of the truth. but none fully captured the gravity Marcus felt as he stepped back into the terminal after a restless night at the hotel. He held his coffee in one hand and his briefcase in the other. Not the metal one he used for court. This was a light tan leather case worn smooth by years of travel. It grounded him, reminded him that despite the noise swirling around him, he was still the same man who boarded that plane last night. A man who nearly vanished into the Atlantic. He paused near a row of seats and watched a nearby TV screen displaying the morning news. The anchor spoke with solemn composure. What could have been a catastrophic failure was prevented only because one passenger raised concerns. The airline has not released names, but witnesses describe him as calm, observant, and Marcus turned away before she finished. He didn't want to become someone's headline. Not today, not ever. He walked deeper into the concourse, hoping to disappear into the rhythm of the airport. But the world had a way of finding him. A woman in her 50s approached slowly. She had graying hair pulled into a loose bun and wore a simple navy coat. Her hands were trembling slightly as she held her phone. "Excuse me," she said softly. Were you the gentleman from Flight 227? Marcus hesitated. He didn't want attention. He didn't want to be praised for doing what any decent person should have done. But the woman's eyes were warm kind, even, and she looked deeply shaken. So he nodded. Yes, I was. Her breath hitched. She pressed a hand to her heart. I wanted to thank you, she whispered. My daughter was on that flight. She's only 19. And if you hadn't noticed that wing, if you hadn't stood your ground, her voice broke. She stepped back slightly, embarrassed by her emotion. Marcus's expression softened. It's all right, he said gently. She's safe. That's what matters. The woman wiped the corner of her eye. I tried to teach her that goodness still exists, that people still look out for each other, even strangers. Last night, you proved I wasn't wrong. Marcus nodded, humbled. I'm glad I could help. Before she walked away, she clasped his hand briefly, a quiet gesture filled with gratitude that felt heavier than any applause. When she disappeared into the crowd, Marcus exhaled slowly. Moments of human honesty always moved him more than grand celebrations, and yet, they also reminded him of the weight he carried not because he wanted to, but because life had taught him how fragile dignity could be. He took a few more steps down the concourse when another voice called out, Mr. Hale. He turned. Miles Carter. Global Air's Regional Operations Director hurried toward him with two assistants behind him. Miles was a tall man with sandy hair, a crisp suit, and the kind of polished corporate smile that rarely faltered. But right now, he looked anxious. Sir, Miles said, slightly out of breath, I'm glad we found you. I wanted to speak with you personally. Marcus lifted an eyebrow. About the inspection. Partly, but also. Miles cleared his throat and lowered his voice. There's media everywhere outside the security gates. They're looking for you. We've declined to share your identity, but passengers have begun posting your name. Of course they had. The world always needed a main character for every crisis. I appreciate the warning, Marcus said, but I have a meeting in D.C. I need to make. I'd like to get on with my travel. Absolutely, Miles said quickly. We've rebooked you on the next available flight. First class. Only 10 passengers. And he hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. We've placed a flag on your reservation. Marcus frowned slightly. A flag, not a negative one, Miles assured. It simply alerts our staff to provide support should you prefer privacy. We want to ensure you're comfortable and that nothing like yesterday ever happens again. The sincerity in his voice was real, a tone Marcus didn't often hear from corporate leaders, but before he could respond, another figure appeared behind Miles, Colin Merrick. His usually perfect hair was disheveled. His eyes were bloodshot. The designer suit he wore hung loosely on his frame, as if he hadn't slept or eaten since last night. He carried no arrogance now, only shame. Miles stepped aside. "Mr. Hale," Colin said quietly, I need to apologize." Marcus studied him carefully. Colin swallowed hard. His voice trembled. "Nothing I say will undo the way I acted. I was entitled. I was disrespectful. And I put my pride above the safety of everyone on that plane." He looked down. His next words came out softer. "You deserved better. From all of us." Marcus didn't answer right away. Part of him wanted to move on. Part of him wanted to remind Colin that apologies only matter when they lead to change. But another part, the part that had survived years of prejudice, misunderstanding, and underestimation, knew that forgiveness wasn't a gift you gave others. It was a release you gave yourself. "You were wrong," Marcus said simply. "But you're taking responsibility now. That matters." Colin nodded slowly, almost painfully. I lost my job this morning. My board confronted me with the videos. I deserved it." Marcus's expression softened just slightly. "I hope you find something better on the other side of this," he said. "Something grounded." Colin let out a shaky breath, almost like relief. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saying that." Miles motioned toward the security checkpoint. "Mr. Hale, we can escort you to your gate if you like." Marcus shook his head. "No, I'll walk." He needed the space, the movement, the time to gather himself again. Miles nodded respectfully. "If you need anything at all, tell any staff member. We're in your debt." Marcus offered a quiet nod and walked away, leaving the cluster of executives behind. As he made his way through the terminal, the murmur of voices rose again. Passengers looked up from their seats, recognizing him. Some offered subtle nods. Others whispered thanks. A few simply watched with quiet respect. But among the faces, he also saw the ones who looked at him differently now, with expectation, with symbolism, with the heavy weight of someone who had become more than a man for better or worse. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be Marcus Hale, a father, a leader, a man who paid attention when others didn't. He reached the large windows overlooking the runway. A different plane was being prepped now. Its silver body gleamed in the sun, a reminder of both fragility and possibility. Marcus stood there, letting the noise of the airport fade. He wasn't angry. He wasn't proud. He wasn't seeking revenge or recognition. He was simply grateful. For life, for truth, for the chance to keep moving forward. And though the world outside buzzed louder with every passing hour, Marcus centered himself in one quiet thought. Sometimes doing the right thing wasn't about bravery. It was about listening, seeing, speaking when no one else did. And that, more than anything, was the reason the plane was still on the ground instead of at the bottom of the ocean. Marcus Hale had never been afraid of flying. He'd crossed the Atlantic more times than he could count corporate trips, arbitration hearings, investor summits, even the occasional weekend escape when life grew too heavy. Airplanes were part of the rhythm of his life, and airports were a familiar backdrop to his career. But today, as he stood in the quiet observation deck overlooking the runways, something inside him felt unsettled. Not fear, not exactly, just a deeper awareness of how thin the line could be between routine and catastrophe, between boarding a flight as usual and becoming a face on the evening news. Marcus rested his hands on the railing and let the warm sunlight spill across his face. Below, a maintenance crew moved methodically around another wide-body aircraft checking landing gear, inspecting the fuselage, testing lines and sensors, watching them. He felt a strange tug inside him, a mix of gratitude and unease. He had seen the underside of aviation last night, its vulnerabilities, its overlooked details, the human mistakes that could break an entire system, and the memory lingered. Footsteps approached softly behind him. "You all right?" Marcus turned. Emily Saunders stood a few feet away, holding a small paper cup of tea. Her hair was tied back neatly, though the exhaustion still clung to her features. She offered a tentative smile. "I saw you walking this way," she said. "Thought you might want someone to talk to." Marcus gave a gentle nod. "Thank you. But I don't want to keep you from your crew." Emily exhaled a heavy sigh from someone who had lived through a long night of consequences. "They've given us a day of rest," she said. "Mandatory. Probably so we don't fall apart in front of passengers." She joined him at the railing, sipping her tea and staring at the runways. "You know," she murmured, "I barely slept. I kept replaying everything in my head. What happened? What almost happened?" Marcus stayed quiet, letting her speak at her own pace. "I kept thinking." Emily's voice trembled slightly. "What if you weren't on that flight? What if nobody else noticed? What if we had taken off and just—" Her breath caught. She forced herself to swallow the rising fear. Marcus spoke softly. "You don't have to finish that thought. It's heavy enough just imagining it." Emily nodded. The sunlight flickered across the aircraft outside, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Somewhere in the distance, a jet roared during takeoff, its engines thundering through the glass windows. Emily flinched at the sound. Marcus noticed. "You love your job," he said gently. "Don't let one night take that away from you." Emily laughed weakly. "It's not the job I'm afraid of. It's the feeling that I failed at it." Marcus turned fully toward her. "You didn't fail," he said, voice steady. "You found your courage when it mattered. You stayed calm. You stood up to your senior crew when things became complicated. That's not failure." Emily looked down. I still should have seen it. The workers on the wing. The way they moved. Something felt off. But I didn't listen to myself. "That's called being human," Marcus replied. "And recognizing it now, that's growth." Her eyes glistened with tears she tried to hide. She whispered, "I feel like people will think I'm incompetent." "People don't get to define you," Marcus said quietly. "Your choices do, and you made the right ones last night." Emily blinked hard, then let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she murmured. "You always speak like you know exactly what someone needs to hear." Marcus chuckled softly. "Occupational hazard. Years of negotiating with billionaires makes you learn how to read people." Emily's smile grew more genuine. They stood together in peaceful silence for a moment, watching as a tug vehicle pulled another aircraft toward the gate. The world outside moved with the steady, uncomplicated rhythm Marcus needed. After a while, Emily angled her head at him. "Can I ask something?" she said. "Of course. When you looked at that wing last night, how did you recognize the danger so fast?" Marcus leaned on the railing, gaze drifting toward the aircraft outside. "It wasn't one thing," he said. "It was everything. I saw the shimmer, first a thin, uneven line where light shouldn't bend that way. Then I remembered a case I worked years ago involving composite fatigue, the same iridescent streak, the same subtle delamination along the actuator plate, and the maintenance crew." He paused. They were moving too fast, too cautious, as if they were trying to hide something. Emily swallowed. "And you just trusted your instinct?" Marcus nodded. "Instinct is usually built on memory you've forgotten you had." Emily let the wisdom settle between them. "Most people would have ignored it," she said. "Most passengers don't even look out the window." "I pay attention," Marcus said. "Always. Life taught me early that sometimes the things people overlook end up being the things that matter most." Emily studied him in quiet admiration. "You remind me of my father," she said softly. "He always said, 'Do the right thing even when no one's watching.' Marcus smiled faintly. Sounds like a good man. He was, she said. He passed a few years ago. Heart failure. But he would have liked you. Marcus placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Thank you. That means a lot. A chime echoed over the intercom. Now boarding Group 1 for Flight 482 to Washington, D. Ye. Marcus looked up at the speaker. That's my flight, he said. Emily nodded. Would you like me to walk you there? Marcus hesitated, then he nodded. They walked side by side through the terminal, weaving past hurried passengers, rolling suitcases, and the smell of early morning coffee. Emily walked a little slower than usual, her steps thoughtful, as if she was processing the lessons of the night. As they approached the gate, the lead agent recognized Marcus immediately and straightened with respectful composure. Mr. Hale, we're ready for you. Please feel free to board any time. Marcus nodded politely. Emily lingered beside him. Uncertain. Will you be okay? She asked. Marcus smiled. I will. She extended her hand. He shook it warmly. Thank you, she said again, for everything, for saving us, but also for how you handled it. You did your part, too, Marcus said. Remember that. Emily's eyes softened, and she stepped back. Marcus turned toward the boarding lane, but before he walked through, he paused and glanced back at her. Emily, yes. Take care of yourself, and don't let fear take away what you love. She nodded firmly. Marcus boarded the jetway, feeling the hum of anticipation in the floor beneath his feet. The narrow corridor opened into the aircraft a smaller cabin than last night's, but warm and quiet. Only a handful of passengers had taken their seats. He sat down near the window, placed his briefcase gently under the seat, and exhaled. As the engines whirred softly and the doors closed, Marcus looked out at the wing steady, clean, whole. Today, he was letting himself trust again, not because he believed the world was flawless, but because he knew he had faced the danger, the arrogance, the indifference, and still chosen clarity over anger, dignity over fear, and that choice had saved them all. Marcus Hale stepped out of the taxi onto the quiet street in northwest Washington, D.C. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of wet pavement after a light drizzle. It was early, barely sunrise, but the neighborhood around the Capitol still buzzed with a subtle energy. Lights glowed from office windows. Delivery trucks hummed past. Joggers traced their familiar routes. Life was moving forward, as if nothing extraordinary had happened the night before. But Marcus felt different. There was a stillness in him now, a quiet gravity, a deeper grounding. He walked toward the glass-fronted building of his legal practice, Hale and Trentwell Partners, the firm he co-founded. The motion sensors clicked on as he approached, illuminating the lobby with a soft, white glow. Inside, the receptionist, a middle-aged Armenian woman named Alina, looked up with surprise. Mr. Hale, you're here early. Morning. Alina, Marcus said gently. Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd get a head start. She studied his face. Everything all right? Sir, Marcus gave a small smile. Everything is intact. That's enough for now. He headed toward his office, but Alina's voice stopped him. They're talking about you on the news, she said softly. About what you did. Marcus slowed. He didn't turn around. He didn't want to hear about it, not yet. Let them talk, he murmured. And he continued down the hallway. His office greeted him with the familiar scent of mahogany and paper-rich, grounding, real. The bookshelves behind his desk held years of cases, journals, and memories. On his desk lay a framed photo of his daughter Liana from her high school graduation, bright smile, proud eyes, curly hair tied in a ribbon. Marcus touched the edge of the frame with a quiet tenderness. He sat down, placed his briefcase aside, and leaned back. The room was still half dark, the city lights outside painting soft reflections across the floor. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again. Finally, with a tired sigh, he checked the screen. A dozen missed calls, nearly 50 text messages, several emails marked urgent, a voicemail from a journalist, another from a local news anchor. Marcus rubbed his forehead, exhaling slowly. He didn't want to be a story. Not when all he had done was speak up when something was wrong. Not when he didn't believe heroism should be tied to race, privilege, or spectacle. He turned the phone face down, but it buzzed again almost immediately, this time with the familiar ringtone he had set for one specific person. His daughter. Marcus answered with surprising eagerness. "Morning. Sweetheart." Dad Liana's voice filled the room, breathless. "Why didn't you tell me I woke up and saw you all over TikTok? And the news, and Twitter. People were messaging me like, 'Is that your dad? The guy who saved the flight?'" Marcus closed his eyes, shaking his head gently. "I didn't want you to worry." "Worried, Dad? You were almost in a plane crash." Her voice cracked, just slightly. That hit him harder than he expected. "I'm okay, Liana," he said softly. "Really?" There was a long pause. Then her voice softened too. "You did the right thing?" "Dad, you always do." A warmth spread through his chest, quiet, steadying. "Thank you," he whispered. "And, you look really cool in those videos," she added with a laugh. "Kind of like a superhero, but like a tired one." Marcus chuckled. "I feel like a tired one." After a few more words, they hung up, but her voice stayed with him like a balm. He was still sitting quietly when a knock sounded at his door. "Come in," Marcus said. The door opened, and his business partner, Jordan Trentwell, stepped inside, tall, sharp-eyed, slightly graying at the temples. Jordan carried both authority and concern in his posture. "You're here early," Jordan said, shutting the door behind him. "I saw the news." Marcus groaned. "Don't you start too?" But Jordan didn't smile. He sat down in the chair across from Marcus, leaning forward. "That could have been catastrophic," Jordan said quietly. "You know that." "Right." Marcus looked away. "Yes. And you saved all those people." "Jordan. No. Listen." Jordan's tone deepened, steady but emotional. "I know you don't want the attention. I know you hate the idea of being anyone's symbol, but the truth is, that kind of courage isn't common." Marcus's jaw tightened. It wasn't courage, he insisted. It was clarity. Anybody paying attention would have done the same. Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Marcus, people don't always pay attention the way you do." Silence stretched between them. Then Jordan added, more softly, "You saw danger, and you didn't let anyone push you aside even when they tried." Marcus clenched his hands lightly, not in anger, in something closer to old, familiar ache. "You know why I didn't move?" "Jordan," he said quietly. Jordan nodded. "Because you've spent your whole life proving you deserved the seat you earned." Marcus didn't respond, but he didn't need to. Jordan leaned back. "You're going to need help managing this. The press, the statements, the attention. We should at least consider stop." Marcus held up a hand. "I don't want a statement. I don't want publicity. I just want to go back to work." Jordan studied him carefully. "All right," he finally said, rising. "But remember, sometimes being visible isn't about ego. Sometimes it's about impact." With that, he left the room. Marcus looked at the door for a long time, unsure whether to feel grateful or exhausted. Maybe both. Later that morning, he walked to a nearby cafe. He frequented a small, cozy place on Massachusetts Avenue known for strong coffee and quiet corner tables. The moment he stepped inside, The barista, a young man named Trevor, spotted him. Trevor froze. Then, with wide eyes, he said, "Sir, is it really you?" Marcus winced inwardly. "Depends who you think I am." Trevor grinned. "The guy who saved Flight 227. Marcus sighed. "I didn't save anything. Engineers and a good captain did that." Trevor shook his head. "My cousin was on that flight." Marcus paused. Trevor's voice softened. "She said she saw you looking out the window. Said she didn't understand why at the time, but now she does." Marcus felt something shift inside him. "Is she all right?" he asked. "She's okay," Trevor said. "Shaken, but grateful. We all are." He handed Marcus a cup of steaming black coffee. "On the house," Trevor said. "Just thanks." Marcus accepted the cup slowly, humbled all over again. "You're welcome." As he turned to leave, Trevor added, "You know, a lot of people online are saying you're a reminder that doing the right thing still matters, that paying attention still matters." Marcus stopped mid-step. He didn't turn. He didn't speak. He just breathed in the weight of that truth. Outside, the city continued its busy rhythm. Cars honked, buses rumbled. People rushed past with their own burdens. But for Marcus Hale, the world felt strangely clearer. Not louder, not heavier, just clearer. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a headline. He was simply a man who refused to look away from danger, from injustice, from the quiet signs others missed. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The conference room on the 7th floor of the Hale and Trentwell Partners building was designed for high-stakes negotiations, thick, soundproof walls, a long walnut table polished to a mirror sheen, and tall windows overlooking the Capitol dome. It was a room built for big decisions. But today, it held something heavier, a story the world was trying to claim, and a man who wasn't sure he wanted to let it. Marcus sat at the head of the table, a file of documents neatly arranged in front of him. Jordan Trentwell stood near the window, arms crossed as he watched a crowd of reporters gather on the street below, their cameras pointed upward, waiting for Marcus. "They're not going away," Jordan said at last. "Every network in the country wants your statement." Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I didn't do anything extraordinary." "You saved lives," Jordan replied. "You recognized a flaw no one else saw, and you refused to be intimidated. People need to hear that." Marcus shook his head. "What they need," he said quietly, "is a world where doing the right thing isn't newsworthy." Before Jordan could respond, the door opened softly. Alina stepped inside, her expression gentle. "Mr. Hale, you have a guest." Marcus frowned. "A guest?" "She insisted it was important," Alina said. "Said she wouldn't leave until you heard her out." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Send her in," Marcus said. Alina nodded and stepped aside. A woman entered late 40s, tall, with sharp, tired eyes and a posture trained by decades of discipline. She carried a small leather portfolio under her arm, and her Global Air badge hung from a lanyard around her neck. Marcus recognized her instantly. Andrea Whitfield, Executive Vice President of Safety and Compliance for Global Air, one of the highest-ranking people in the company. "Mr. Hale," Andrea said quietly. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Marcus gestured to a seat. "Please." She sat across from him, placing the portfolio on the table. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. "I want to begin with the simple truth," she said. "You're the reason 212 people are alive today, and the reason we're sitting here instead of before a congressional inquiry." Marcus didn't respond. Andrea continued. "I'm not here to manage the situation. I'm here to take responsibility." Jordan stepped forward. Responsibility for what exactly? Andrea opened her portfolio. Inside were several printed reports. engineering diagrams, and a copy of the flight log from the previous night. There was a failure in inspection protocol, she said, a serious one. The third-party maintenance team assigned to Flight 227 rushed the job. They logged the inspection as complete without performing the required stress test on the actuator compartment. Marcus clenched his jaw. They falsified the inspection, he asked. Yes, Andrea said, shame softening her voice. We discovered it early this morning. And they admitted they were under pressure to turn the aircraft around quickly. Jordan muttered a curse under his breath. Andrea continued. If you hadn't noticed the delamination, if you hadn't called it out, there's a high chance the aircraft would have suffered catastrophic failure over open water. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. He didn't need to hear the rest. He knew what would have happened. He'd seen the aftermath in cases he had litigated years ago, families shattered, lives lost in seconds. Andrea took a slow breath. I'm here because we need your help. Marcus opened his eyes. My help, he repeated. Andrea nodded. We're preparing a full transparency report for the FAA and the Department of Transportation, and we need your testimony. Jordan stepped forward sharply. Absolutely not. Marcus raised a hand gently. Let her finish. Andrea continued. Your testimony isn't about blame. It's about what you observed, what you saw, what made you speak up when others didn't. Marcus shook his head. And what would that accomplish? Another report no one reads? No, Andrea said firmly. It will change our protocols, permanently, and it will protect other passengers on other flights. Your voice carries weight not because of who you are, but because of what you saw. The room fell into stillness. Marcus rested his hands on the table, fingers pressing lightly into the wood. He wasn't afraid of telling the truth. That was his life's work. But he hated the idea of becoming a symbol someone the world pointed to and said, see, look. He didn't want to be used. He didn't want to be transformed into a headline that outgrew the truth. Jordan sensed his hesitation. Marcus, Jordan said gently, you don't owe them anything. Marcus shook his head. It's not about owing. He looked at Andrea. If I do this, will it prevent something like this from happening again? Andrea met his gaze with raw sincerity. Yes, she said. It will. Marcus sat back in his chair. The silence stretched, thick with weight and implication. Finally, he nodded once. All right, he said quietly. I'll give my testimony. Andrea exhaled in visible relief, so relieved she had to steady herself with a hand on the table. Thank you, she murmured. You don't know what this means. I know exactly what it means, Marcus replied. That's why I'm doing it. She rose, extended her hand, and Marcus shook it firmly. Before she left, she paused at the door. One more thing, she said softly. Captain Grant asked me to deliver a message. Marcus looked up, surprised. Andrea smiled faintly. He said, Tell him that he saved more than lives last night. He saved the truth. Marcus felt a subtle warmth in his chest. After she left, Jordan turned to him. You sure about this? He asked. Marcus nodded. I am. Jordan placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Then I'll support you every step of the way. 2 hours later, Marcus walked into a small, private conference room where Global Air's legal team waited. They stood respectfully when he entered. No cameras. Andrea assured him. No press. Just your account. Marcus sat down. He spoke calmly, clearly, with the same composure he carried in boardrooms, but with a deeper honesty, one shaped by the fragility of the night before. He described the shimmer on the wing, the pattern of fatigue in the composite layer, the subtle behavior of the rushed maintenance crew, the signs he recognized from an aviation case years ago, the pressure from the flight attendants, the refusal to move, the moment realization struck. He did not exaggerate. He did not dramatize. He told the truth simply and completely. And when he finished, the room was silent. One of the attorneys whispered, almost reverently, "Thank you, Mr. Hale." Marcus nodded and stood. As he walked out, Andrea stopped him gently in the hallway. "You did the right thing," she said. Marcus replied quietly, "Doing the right thing shouldn't be this rare." Andrea didn't argue. She simply nodded in agreement. That evening, as Marcus left the building, the sky was streaked with orange and gold. D.E. Traffic hummed below, horns echoing through the narrow streets. He paused on the sidewalk, breathing in the warm evening air. He had given his testimony. He had faced the truth again, this time not about the wing, but about himself. He wasn't running from the story anymore. He was shaping it, guiding it, owning it, not for recognition, but because truth, once spoken, had the power to steady the world. And tonight, he felt something he hadn't felt since the moment he spotted the delamination on that wing. He felt at peace. The sun had just begun its slow descent when Marcus Hale returned home that evening. The neighborhood was quiet children chalking sidewalks, a dog barking somewhere across the street, the low hum of a lawnmower winding down. Normal life, the kind of ordinary peace he had almost never lived to see again. Marcus stepped inside his townhouse, setting his keys on the small wooden tray by the door. A soft warmth filled the space, the smell of cedar from the bookshelf, the quiet thrum of the air conditioner, the muted glow of the lamp beside the couch. Then he saw her. Liana sat cross-legged on the couch, wearing an oversized hoodie, scrolling through her laptop. When she noticed him, she jumped to her feet and rushed toward him. "Dad." Marcus barely had time to open his arms before she embraced him tight. Emotional. Unfiltered. He held her firmly, resting a hand on the back of her head. "You okay?" she asked, pulling back slightly. "I am now," he said with a soft smile. She gestured toward the laptop. "The video. The story. It's everywhere. People are talking about courage, about integrity, about you." Marcus sighed gently. "I didn't do it for attention." "I know," she said. "But maybe that's why it matters even more." They sat down on the couch. Liana opened her laptop again. "Look," she said, "there's something you should see." She hit play. A news clip appeared an interview outside the airport earlier that day. A woman with silver-streaked hair spoke into the microphone, her voice trembling. "That man, the one who noticed the wing he saved my daughter," she said. "It wasn't his job. He didn't owe us anything. But he paid attention. He stood up when others didn't. And because of that, my child is alive." Liana paused the video, her eyes glistening. "She's not the only one," she whispered. "There are hundreds of comments, thousands, people saying you made them believe in decency again." Marcus looked away, emotion tightening his chest, not pride, not ego, but something more vulnerable. "What happened up there?" he said quietly. "It wasn't just about a wing or a seat. It was about the moment you realize how fragile life really is, how quickly everything can change." Liana nodded, listening intently. Marcus continued, voice steady but soft. "When they asked me to move, it wasn't the first time someone decided I didn't belong somewhere, and it probably won't be the last. But standing my ground wasn't about defiance. It was about dignity, about refusing to shrink." Liana reached over and held his hand. "I'm proud of you." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "I'm proud of you, too." A peaceful silence settled over them, warm, grounding. Then Liana said, "So, what happens now?" Marcus leaned back, letting out a thoughtful breath. Now he said, "Life goes on. I'll keep working, traveling, paying attention, and maybe I'll keep reminding people that doing the right thing doesn't always require noise. Sometimes it just requires a steady voice. And a good pair of eyes. Liana teased. Marcus laughed. That, too. A soft knock sounded at the door. Liana frowned, expecting someone. No, Marcus said, rising. He opened the door. Captain Elias Grant stood on the porch, still in uniform, holding a small package wrapped neatly in navy paper. His expression was warm, but solemn. Evening, Mr. Hale, he said. Captain. Marcus replied with surprise. What are you doing here? I had a flight into D.C. today, Grant said. Thought I'd deliver this in person. He handed Marcus the package. Marcus opened it carefully. Inside was a polished metal plaque, simple, elegant, engraved with deliberate precision. To Marcus Hale, whose clarity saved lives, whose courage restored truth, and whose dignity reminded us all what leadership means. Marcus looked up, moved beyond words. Grant cleared his throat. I just wanted to make sure you knew. The crew, the passengers, my own family, we're all here because you chose to speak when it mattered. Marcus swallowed. Thank you. Truly. Grant extended his hand. The skies are safer because of you. Marcus shook it firmly. And they're safer because of you. Liana stepped beside her father. Are you the captain? She asked shyly. Grant smiled. I am. And your father is the kind of passenger pilots pray for. Marcus chuckled. Let's not make that a trend. They all laughed softly. Grant gave a respectful nod and stepped back. Take care of yourself. Marcus, you too, Captain. As the door closed, Marcus held the plaque in both hands, feeling its weight. Not heavy, just true. Liana looked at him with quiet admiration. You know, you didn't just stop a disaster. You started something. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Started what a conversation, she said. About fairness, courage, humanity. Maybe even about how we look at each other. Marcus set the plaque on the mantel and stepped back. Then he wrapped an arm around his daughter and pulled her close. That, he said softly, is worth more than any headline. Outside, an airplane soared through the dusk sky, its lights blinking steadily as it climbed higher. Marcus watched it for a moment. Calm, settling into him like a final exhale. He no longer feared the memory of the wing. He no longer carried the weight of the night. Truth had taken flight, and dignity quiet, steady, unshakable, had gone with it. The story Black Lawyer Asked to Move for VIP Passenger is not just about an incident on a flight. It reflects a silent reality that many people experience being overlooked, undervalued, pushed aside for no reason. What makes the story special is not the drama, but how Marcus Hale, with composure and intelligence, chooses to stand firm in a situation that could have made people explode or break them. Perhaps the biggest lesson is this: courage is not always about being loud. Sometimes, courage is about staying calm when you are offended, choosing truth over silence, choosing dignity over temporary comfort. For adults who have experienced many ups and downs, this story reminds us that respect is not something someone gives us. It is a value we must maintain. And just one timely action, a small amount of awareness, can change our whole life and the lives of many others. Finally, I would like to send you, the viewer, my sincerest thanks. Thank you for taking the time, emotion, and companionship to listen to a story about self-respect and humanity. If this story makes you think or find a part of yourself in it, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so I can continue to bring you more meaningful stories.